Good morning, boys and girls, and welcome to today's lesson. Happy Monday. I hope you all had a wonderful weekend. Today's lesson is Module 15, Lesson 4. Use reasoning strategies to compare fractions. If you turn to page 413, you can follow along in the I can objective as I read it aloud. I can use different reasoning strategies to compare fractions. If we think about this objective, boys and girls, we've already been comparing fractions. What kind of fractions have we already compared? Right, we've compared fractions that have the same denominators, and we compared fractions that have the same numerators. So we're going to take what we've learned already, and we're going to build on it to compare any type of fractions. But before we get started, let's review. Let's first take a look at comparing fractions with the same denominator. If you take a look at the screen on the left, you'll see that there's two fraction bars. And each of the fraction bars are broken up into 6 equal parts, or sixths. So now let's compare two fractions with the same denominator. Let's compare 2 sixths and 4 sixths. Okay? Since both fractions have the same denominators, we know that our parts are going to be the same size. And then we can just look at our numerators, 2 parts or 4 parts, and see which one is greater. So I know that 2 parts is less than 4 parts. And if I'm using my fraction bars, I can show 2 sixths from here to here, and I can show 4 sixths from here to here. So 2 sixths is less than 4 sixths. And I would just go ahead and put my symbol. Now for the next one, comparing fractions with the same numerator, I saw a few misconceptions here and I want to review them. So for this one, boys and girls, I'm putting up two fraction bars that have different denominators. Okay? One of them is broken up into 3 equal parts, or thirds, and the other one is broken up into 8 equal parts, or eighths. What I'm comparing here is fractions that have the same numerator but different denominators. So in this one, I know that I have a fraction that's broken up into thirds and a fraction that's broken up into eighths. But I want my same numerator. So let's make the numerator 2 equal parts. What do we know about the parts in thirds compared to the parts in eighths? Take a look at their size. Well, I can see that when my denominator is smaller, like thirds, my parts are greater. Okay, so now let's take a look at 2 parts out of 3 and 2 parts out of 8. Well, if my parts in the thirds are greater, then I know that 2 thirds is going to be greater than 2 eighths, because even though I'm counting 2 parts for each one, the sizes of those parts are a lot bigger. So 2 thirds is greater than 2 eighths. Let's look at the build understanding. Ian's granola bar recipe calls for 2/3 cup of oats. Sadie's recipe uses 3/4 cup of oats. Whose recipe uses fewer oats? Show how to compare 2/3 and 3/4. So I see my granola bars here. What do I notice about both granola bars? That's right, they're the same size. Now remember, my models, when I create my models, they must be the same size in order to compare fractions. And if I look at the two models that are already labeled with Ian and Sadie, I notice that the two models are in fact the same size. So what can I do to compare those fractions? Well, I don't know about you, but I would break up my models so that I can compare the fractions. So I'm going to break up Ian's model into thirds because his recipe uses 2/3 cup of oats. And then I'm going to break up Sadie's recipe into 3/4 into fourths because her recipe uses fourths. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. Let's see. Thirds about here and here, and fourths. Okay. So I know that Ian's granola bar recipe calls for 2/3. And Sadie's recipe uses 3/4. Okay. And the question is asking whose recipe uses fewer. Fewer is another word for what, boys and girls? Less. Okay. So whose recipe uses the least amount of oats? Okay. Ian's recipe does. You can see by the bar model or the fraction bar that it is less shaded. So he's using less oats. So what fractions represent the missing of each piece? So now in another color, I want to go ahead and I want to show you the missing piece, okay? So the missing piece in Ian's, if this is 2/3, what's the missing piece here? 1/3. 2/3 and 1/3 would give you his whole, one whole cup of 3/3. And then for Sadie's, she uses 1, 2, 3 parts or 3/4. So what would be the missing piece in here? It would be 1/4. Okay. Now, instead of looking at how much they're using, let's look at what's missing to make a whole. So the fractions that represent the missing piece of the whole is 1/3 and 1/4. Do the missing pieces have the same numerator or the same denominator? Well, they each have a 1 in the numerator, so they have the same numerator. How can you use the size of the missing pieces to compare 2/3 and 3/4? Well, let's take a look. Okay, on the side we have our same bar model, and I've broken the first one up into thirds and the second one up into fourths. Okay, and I'm going to circle our missing piece or highlight our missing piece. So for Ian's, this piece right here was the missing piece. And for Sadie's, this was the missing piece. Okay, what do we know about 1/3 and 1/4? Well, we know that 1 part out of 3 is greater than 1 part out of 4. So we know that Ian had more missing in order to get to one whole. If you have more missing in order to get to a whole, then you have less than the other person. So how can you use the size of the missing pieces to compare 2/3 and 3/4? Well, if you know the size of the missing pieces, you can compare them to see who is missing more to get to a whole. And the person who's missing more, then they have less. Okay, imagine your Pokemon cards, boys and girls, and let's say that you're trying to collect to make a whole set. If you're the person that's missing more cards, then you're going to have less cards to begin with, okay? So if you're missing more to get to the whole, then you're going to have less cards. And whose recipe uses fewer oats? Well, Ian uses fewer oats because his missing piece is greater. Boys and girls, comparing those missing pieces is just another strategy that you can use to compare fractions. If you noticed, 2/3 and 3/4 had a different denominator, but they also had a different numerator. So we couldn't use the strategies that we used last week to compare fractions. Number 2, Beth's glass of orange juice is 3/8 full. Leo's glass is 3/4 full. Both glasses hold the same amount. Whose glass has more juice? Choose a strategy to compare the fractions. So let me write some of the information over to the side. So we have Beth, and her glass is 3/8 full. And we have Leo's, and his glass is 3/4 full. And we know that the glasses are the same size, or they hold the same amount of juice. Okay, whose glass has more juice? Choose a strategy to compare the fractions. Well, let's look from our strategies. Our first strategy is the same denominator. Well, let's take a look at our denominators. We have an 8 and a 4, so we don't have the same denominators. We have same numerator. Well, let's take a look at our numerators, a 3 and a 3. I think we can use this strategy, same numerator. Okay, and what does it tell us? It says the fraction with a smaller denominator is greater. And why is that, boys and girls? Well, when you have the same numerator, you take a look at the denominator. The denominator that's smaller means those parts are greater, so it makes the fraction greater. Okay? To compare the fractions, which strategy works best? Well, I'm going to use same numerator. Because both fractions have a 3 in the numerator, or as the numerator. Okay, and which fraction is greater? Whose glass has more juice? Explain your answer. Well, let's take a look. Our numerators are the same. So now I look at my denominators. The smaller denominator means I have bigger parts, so that's greater fraction. So 4 is smaller than 8, so 3/4 would be a greater fraction. So 3/8 is less than 3/4. So 3/4 is greater. And Leo has more juice. Okay, boys and girls, let's practice these strategies with a few more fractions that we're going to compare. On your screen, you'll see that you have fraction bars. And all a fraction bars are, boys and girls, is you have one bar that equals 1 whole. And that's this top one right here. Okay, and all of the other bars are the same size. Except they're broken up into unit fractions. So for example, you see that the first one underneath that is broken up into 2 equal parts, or 1/2 and 1/2. And then the next one is broken up into thirds, or 3 equal parts, and then fourths. And then in green you have fifths, and then sixths, and eighths, and tenths, and all the way at the bottom you have a fraction bar that's broken up into twelfths, or 12 equal parts. So we're going to practice our strategies that we've learned, but then we're going to refer back to these fraction bars to prove our thinking. When these fraction bars are lined up, it's very easy to compare fractions. So let's do a quick practice one on the fraction bars. I'm going to compare 1/2 and 1/3. Okay? I locate my bars that are broken up into halves and thirds, and it would be this one and this one. Okay, and now I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to circle or highlight or shade in one part of each. So now I'm able to compare 1/2 and 1/3. I see that 1/2 has a greater amount of space, so 1/2 is greater than 1/3. Okay, now as I clear these examples, let's take a look at our first set of fractions that we're going to compare. We have 2/5 and 2/3. What strategy can we use to compare these two fractions? Well, since they both have a 2 in the numerator, I would use the strategy same numerator. I know that when I have two fractions that have the same numerator, I look at the denominators and I find the one that is the smallest. The smallest denominator is actually going to be the biggest fraction because the parts are going to be bigger. So I know that 2/5 is less than 2/3 because the denominator of 3 is smaller than my denominator of 5. But now let's find that on our fraction bars. I'm going to locate the strip that is counting by fifths, which is here, and I'm going to locate the strip that is counting by thirds. Okay, and now in each of those, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to circle 2 parts. So 2/5 would be this amount, and 2/3 is this amount. And my fraction bar shows me that yes, 2/3 is greater than 2/5. Let's take a look at the next one. What strategy might we use for this one? Well, the numerators are not the same because I have a 4 and a 6, but look at their denominators. You have an 8 and an 8. So we're going to use same denominator strategy. Okay, the numerators are the same, so now the denominators are the same, I'm sorry. So now we're going to look at the numerators. And this one is pretty easy. It's 4 parts out of 8 or 6 parts out of 8. We know that since they're both out of 8, those parts are the same size. So now we're just comparing quantity. 4 parts or 6 parts. Well, 6 parts is greater. So let's locate our 1/8 bar on the left, and I find it right here. Okay, and I'm going to go ahead and show you 4/8. 1, 2, 3, 4. And then I'm going to show you 6/8. I can go all the way up to here. I know that's 4, and then 5, 6. So on my fraction bar, I can clearly see that 6/8 is greater than 4/8. How much greater is it? Well, it's 1 2/8 greater. Okay, and let's look at our last example. I don't see a common same numerator. I don't see the same denominator. What I do see is that they each have a missing piece. They have one missing piece. So let's use the missing piece strategy. Okay, so 3/4 has a missing piece of 1/4. And 7/8 has a missing piece of 1/8. Now let's focus on the 1/4 and the 1/8. What do you know about those two fractions? Which one of those is greater? Right, 1/4 is greater because the denominator is smaller. So 1 part out of 4 is bigger than 1 part out of 8. So if 3/4 has a bigger missing piece, then 3/4 is going to be smaller. Okay, and let's prove it on our fraction bar. Let's find fourths, which would be here, and let's find eighths. So let me erase this. We're going to use eighths again. Okay, and now I'm going to go ahead and highlight 3/4. Okay, and now I'm going to go ahead and highlight 7/8. I know 7/8 is almost the entire thing. It's missing one piece. Okay, so take a look at the size of this missing piece here, boys and girls, and this missing piece. Okay, and you'll notice that 1/4 is a bigger missing piece than 1/8, so it's further away from the whole. So 3/4 is smaller than 1/8. And if I draw a line right through the other fraction bars, okay, I can see where 3/4 is and 1/8. So 3/4 is less than 1/8. Okay, boys and girls, it's your turn. You're going to pause the video here. You're going to go into your book and complete the check understanding and the on your own. And when you're finished, you're going to come back and we will check it together. Okay, welcome back, boys and girls. Let's see how you did. Number 1, Trent can hold his breath for 4/6 minutes. Is this greater than or less than 2/6 of a minute? Well, let's take a look before we use our models. We have 4/6 and we have 2/6. What do we notice about those two fractions? Well, they have the same denominator, so we can quickly use that strategy to help us compare. The parts are the same size because the denominators are the same. So then I'm talking about 2 parts or 4 parts. And I know that 4 parts is greater than 2 parts. So 4/6 is greater than 2/6. So 4/6 is greater than 2/6. So draw to show reasoning. So let's draw our model just like our fraction bars that we finished working with, just to prove our point. And I'm going to separate each one into 6. Okay, and I'm going to make the first one 4/6, and I always label them, and 2/6. And I'm going to go ahead and shade 1, 2, 3, 4/6, and then 1, 2/6. And my fraction bars prove that 4/6 is greater than 2/6. Compare, write less than, greater than, or equal to. Write the strategy that you used. Okay, well, let's take a look. Number 2, 5/6 and 2/3. Well, the numerators are not the same. The denominators are not the same. But I do notice that they're each missing one piece. So I'm going to use missing piece. Okay. So now we know that 5/6 is missing 1/6, and 2/3 is missing 1/3. Okay, I know that 1/3 is greater than 1/6, so 2/3 is further away from the whole. So 5/6 is greater than 2/3. Number 3, 3/8 and 3/6. Well, I'm going to use same numerator. Because they each have a numerator of 3. Okay, then I take a look at my parts. One of them is broken up into 8 parts and the other one is broken up into 6 parts. 6 parts means that the parts are greater. So 3/8 is less than 3/6. And then I have 3/4 and 2/4. And I notice that they each have the same denominator. So now all I have to do is compare my parts. 3 parts is greater than 2 parts, so 3/4 is greater than 2/4. Number 5, On a spelling test, Diane spells 5/6 of the words correctly. Bill spells 4/5 of the words correctly. Explain why the missing pieces strategy should work for comparing the fractions. Which fraction is greater? How do you know? Well, 4/5 is missing 1/5 to make a whole, and 5/6 is missing 1/6 to make a whole. So you should be able to use the missing piece strategy because they're each missing one piece. And if I compare those pieces, so let's write 4/5 and let's write 5/6. Okay, this is missing 1/5 is missing and 1/6 is missing. I know that 1/5 is a greater missing piece than 1/6. So that means that 4/5 is not as close to one whole as 5/6. So 5/6 is greater. Compare. Write less than, greater than, or equal to. What strategy? Write the strategy you used. So again, 1/5 or 1/8. It has the same numerator. Okay, and I know that if I'm comparing my denominators, 5 equal parts the parts are going to be bigger than if I broke something up into 8 equal parts. So 1/5 is greater than 1/8. 3/4 and 5/4. These have the same denominator. Okay, and now I'm thinking about 3 parts or 5 parts. Well, 5 parts is definitely bigger. As a matter of fact, 5/4 is bigger than 1 whole, and I know that 3/4 is not. And then number 8, 8/9 or 3/4. Well, they don't have the same numerator, they don't have the same denominator, but they are each one piece away from a whole. So our missing piece here is 1/9, and our missing piece here is 1/4. I know that 1/4 is greater than 1/9, so that means that 3/4 has a greater missing piece. It's further away from the one whole. So 8/9 is greater than 3/4. And I used the missing piece strategy. Number 9, write and solve a word problem that uses the same numerator strategy to compare two fractions. Include a visual model with your problem. So this one will be different for everyone, boys and girls. Okay, if I were to write and solve a word problem that uses the same numerator strategy to compare two fractions, it would probably involve Scarlett and Tyler and two fractions that show maybe how many cookies out of the whole box they ate. Okay. Okay, boys and girls, it's your turn now. Here are your codes for your Nearpod activity. For the English activity, your code is ZKUPJ. Para português, o vosso código é LHYIV. Y para la actividad en español es PXNZK. Okay, do your best and don't forget to like and subscribe.